All right. Well, those of you who were here last year, we had a very lively discussion about antitrust issues in one of the workshops last year. So I'm kind of hoping, and some of these people were here then, so I'm kind of hoping that we can kind of continue that and expand it to bring it forward here and include more people. Let me briefly introduce the panelists here, and there's longer descriptions in the program. Susan Athey is a professor of economics. Actually, she's in transit. She's been at Harvard for a number of years, and she is in the process of moving to Stanford. She is also a consultant to Microsoft in the role of, has also played the role of chief economist there. She is the recipient of numerous honors, including being the first female recipient of the AEA's John Bates Clark Medal, member of the National Academy of Sciences, and many more. Tim Bresnahan is the Landau Professor of Technology and Economy at Stanford. He is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics in the Antitrust Division. I'm actually going in alphabetical order, so here, but Carlos Kirjner is Vice President and Senior Analyst for Internet at Alliance Bernstein. He was formerly a Senior Advisor to the Chairman of the FCC, working on the National Broadband Plan, and he has a PhD in Electrical Engineering from Berkeley. Bill Kovacic is the Global Competition Professor of Law and Policy at the GW Law School. He has long experience at the FTC, including serving as General Counsel, Commissioner, as well as Chairman. Edith Ramirez is a current commissioner at the FTC, where she has been a commissioner since 2010. She was previously a partner in the LA Law Office of Quinn, Emanuel, Urquhart, and Sullivan, and she is a graduate of Harvard Law School, where she was editor of the Law Review and of Harvard College. And Hal Varian is chief economist at Google, and where he's involved in many aspects of the company, including corporate strategy and public policy issues. And he is an emeritus professor at UC Berkeley in economics, business, and information management. Let me start, since nominally we have subtitled this conference, what are something to do with the elections. Let me start with kind of an election-related question. In last Friday's Politico, there was an article on antitrust enforcement in the Obama administration, one of several articles like that recently. And the article kind of was trying to evaluate the claim that the Obama administration was going to make up for the lax enforcement of antitrust during the Bush administration. And the article was general, focusing on antitrust generally. But if we just focus on kind of the internet and tech sectors, it seems to me the following is kind of a summary of the major high points of antitrust in the last 3.5 years. Since the beginning of 2009, there have been 126 acquisitions by the five big internet firms: Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. None were blocked. 7 had an extended review, and conditions were attached to 1, the ITA acquisition by Google. In the communications sector, obviously you have the AT&T T-Mobile deal, which was blocked, the Comcast NBCU deal, which was cleared with conditions, and most recently the Verizon cable spectrum deal, which is not finalized, but is presumably being cleared with conditions. We have the Intel consent decree with the FTC. We have the Apple eBooks agency pricing case, and we have the Google investigation, which is underway. So, you know, looking at the internet and tech sectors, and let me first direct this question to Edith, since she is a sitting official. Has enforcement by the Obama administration been more aggressive than during the Bush administration?
Tom, let me tackle that question by making two observations, and I'm going to focus my remarks with regard to the FTC. And let me start by saying that the FTC, and then I'll describe sort of the nature and the structure of the agency, and there's some important considerations to take into account that I think explain why you don't see a wide variation across administrations. Number one, we're an independent agency. We're bipartisan as a matter of statute. And we're also very consensus-oriented. So I think that our core enforcement agenda will be very similar across administrations if you take sort of a historical look at this question. But to me, the more important question to ask in terms of assessing whether or not we're being effective as an enforcement agency is to ask whether we're applying the antitrust laws in a sound and an economically grounded way. And I would say that we are. I think the FTC has had some very important successes, particularly when it comes to the healthcare sector, which of course is very important to the economy, by reinvigorating our hospital merger cases and our success in that regard. I think the Intel settlement that you mentioned is also an important success. But I think we have also shown significant restraint. And two examples of that would be one in the high-tech arena involving Google's acquisition of the ad network AdMob. And then more recently, in the healthcare sector, the acquisition of ESI, by ESI of Medco in the PBM industry, where there was an arguably strong case to be made for a structural strong case. And there was also a lot of pressure put on the agency by Congress, by consumer groups and others in that industry. And yet, when we looked very closely at the facts, we ended up determining that the appropriate course to take was to close that investigation. So I think when you evaluate how we've been applying the antitrust laws, I think we've been enforcement-minded, but at the same time, we've been looking very closely at the facts and only taken action where we think it's necessary to do so.
Bill, as a fairly recent antitrust enforcer, what would your answer be to that question?
I think at the FTC there's been a great deal of continuity, but I think there's an epidemic failure in our field to seek the sharp distinctions based on the identity of the president. You just heard Scott talking about the importance of how learning and experience are cumulative. Where did lots of the healthcare developments of the last few years come from? The FTC invested a massive amount of effort in the earlier part of the last decade that led to cases like Evanston and Inova, published a path-breaking report in 2003 on 2004 on competition policy in healthcare. I think when you look at what we desperately need is a better way to evaluate agency performance. What also I think is destructive in the debate about where policy has gone is that notice that everything Tom talked about deals with law enforcement. And this is the common measure of how agencies are doing. You are whom you sue. And it's activity, not accomplishment, that counts. The runs that you put up on the board are the number of cases. Extra credit for big cases, which is why if I were Mount Google or Mount Apple, I'd really be worried about being scaled today and summited by a competition agency somewhere in the world. What we ought to be asking is not activity, but accomplishment. And accomplishment ought to be measured not just by litigation activity, but investments in building knowledge and in the larger consultation process. Examples of what the FTC did related to Scott's talk. The FTC convened major proceedings in the previous decade on the patent system. I look at this panel, I see a couple of people who testified at those proceedings. It resulted in a major report in 2003 on the patent system and reforms The Commission issued another report with DOJ in 2007, and then last year, another FTC report on patent remedies. A massive investment in the non-litigation agenda, with the notion being that in many instances, the roots of better performance are going to lie in non-litigation approaches or in collateral areas of policy. And in addition to this, yes, you had a litigation program. You had Rambus, which, though unsuccessful, was the first time the Federal Trade Commission had been before the Court of Appeals in a abusive dominance case since the early part of the 1980s. So I think what disturbs me about the discussion of who's ahead, who's moved ahead, is one, again, the epidemic failure to have a sensible measure of what constitutes good performance. The focus on the prosecution of cases, which is the equivalent for an airline of measuring departures rather than arrivals, rather than outcomes. But more important, competition policy is more than just law enforcement. And if we're going to promote this type of conversation and analysis of root causes of policy failures and improvements, that's going to require a major investment in knowledge and an examination of collateral areas of activity. So if I ask myself, as I do now, what's the basis for the grade in this course? Enforcement's one line. But the other things that count for the final grade are things like this investment in R&D.
Well, let me, just before we get off this thing about whether different administrations make a difference, let me just ask whether antitrust might be different depending on the outcome of the upcoming election. Let me focus it on one particular aspect of the FTC, which is potentially different in different administrations, which is the use of Section 5 of the FTC Act in antitrust. Is that something, and anybody can take this, is that something that will depend on the outcome of the upcoming election? Maybe it's easier for
Tom, I think the ideological tilt theories of what the Antitrust Enforcement Agency does are just way exaggerated. It's mostly technocratic. If there were a lot of opportunities in the one area where it might matter is in monopolization matters. They're not, I wouldn't forecast that there are any interesting monopolization matters going to be in anybody's inbox. So I would say the election does, it's interesting. I hadn't realized how high my market share was. You said there were 7 tech sector merger cases in the last 3 years. I worked for the defense on 3 of them. I'm not particularly a defense guy. And I'd have to say, my experience from that is that the difference over the imaginable range of US antitrust enforcement activities influenced by ideology, like that imaginable range is here, and then you got the EU way over here. Because of its radically different procedures. I mean, it's just, these things are just, everybody wants the ideological needle to be what matters, but it's very technocratic.
Let me just go ahead and interject and make the observation. I think the point that was made about ideological tilt being exaggerated, I think is an important one to make. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there will be some subtle differences in the way one views what action the agency should take. But I have to say that for me personally, the way I look at every case, I'm going to be looking at the facts. And I think my colleagues are driven by the facts. So ultimately, that is what guides us. And all of us are trying to do the right thing for consumers and for competition.
John, if I can just take on the Section 5 point, as this audience knows, the FTC has a distinctive mandate that allows it to go beyond settled doctrine for the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and it's in the prohibition against unfair methods of competition. I mean, in theory, it does provide an elastic basis for extending the law. The last time the FTC prevailed in the federal courts, in a standalone Section 5 case was 1968. That's a while ago. Not for want of trying either. And one of the crippling limitations has been the failure to define in a meaningful way what the key operative criteria of that standard are. And as I read the jurisprudence in case after case, the courts have said, I might be with you on this one, but can you tell me how far this goes? Are we going to the moon? Are we going to the end of the solar system? Is it the universe and all it contains? I'd like to have some idea of what the boundaries are. And in its 100-year history, the FTC has never defined in a policy statement just what those are. So I think if you had the daily racing form of the FTC on Section 5 of the FTC Act and look at the actual results, it's a long time since this commission has persuaded a federal court that is a sustainable theory of liability. So I wouldn't see that as a dramatic source of expansion or even a marginal source of expansion. I think what's more important is how conventional Sherman Act doctrine is interpreted. And I think Tim put his finger on a critical consideration. Now, if we ask what jurisdiction is the most influential globally in setting standards for dominant firm behavior, it's the European Commission. The US has a secondary role. That jurisprudence is more elastic. And the real question ought to be, how do we go about setting sensible global standards in a setting in which the US, the EU, and right behind them, China and India, will individually be able to set global standards by their individual choices of how to deal with single firm conduct.
And we will get to the international issues shortly. But let me before we do that, let me shift toward a little towards economics, and just for the sake of discussion, let me offer two kind of polar views, or maybe not polar views, just two contrasting views. One view is that the internet looks increasingly like a monopoly board. This is almost a quote, but with major sectors controlled by a dominant company or oligopoly, and that view was expressed by Tim Wu, and presumably took on more importance when he was subsequently hired as a special advisor at the FTC. The alternative view was reflected in Kent's speech, is that these dominant firms face intense competition from many sources, including notably from each other. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple compete on multiple dimensions, each of them trying to get into each other's markets. So I guess my question is, do one or both or neither of these statements tell us anything useful about what's happening in terms of competition on the internet? And let me first ask Susan about that, and then maybe go to Carlos.
Sure. So I think that both views have their uses in understanding the nature of competition. I think that, of course, at a high level, the firms are viewing themselves in platform competition, and some of the choices that they're making and the incentives that they're facing need to be framed in that light. At the same time, individual products can still have market power, and those products can influence the effectiveness of the platform competition, and of course they can influence the outcomes in those particular markets. So something like search is something that is a particular product where if you have dominance in that product, you can influence the effectiveness of competition in lots of related markets. So all the websites we love to find on the internet, you can influence which ones are found and which ones are not found. So that kind of power, that sort of bottleneck of being between the consumer and where they want to go, can influence the nature of competition. And then, of course, the fact that search revenues are used to fund a lot of activities on the internet. So the syndication market, the fact that search engines, when they compete with each other, share revenue with websites. So when you have a little search box on a website, that if you have two competing search engines going after that box, the money from search doesn't accrue to the search engine so much. It actually accrues to the website that actually attracted the consumers there. But when you don't have competing search engines, the revenue doesn't get shared, or doesn't get shared nearly as greatly. So I think that you can think in the context of overall platform competition, but at the same time, individual bottlenecks can really shape the way that competition occurs, picking winners and losers, and potentially preventing the most popular and the most effective services, the most innovation from occurring. And so that's really, I think, a place where enforcement has to take a look. If we all love all the stuff that's out there on the internet, we need to understand the role that individual monopolies can play in either promoting or discouraging the investment by the venture capital community and so on in firms that might be shut down by a dominant player.
So let me try to answer your question on whether either of the statements is useful by sharing two things that I think are facts, or they're true-ish. Number one, if you had a room with the top 100 most sophisticated, thoughtful, long-term fundamental investors, and you ask them, who are Google's major competitors? You would not get Microsoft, Yelp, or TripAdvisor as the answer. The answer you'd get are Apple and Amazon, potentially Facebook, as a coming below. So that's, I am pretty sure of that because I talk to these people. That's what I do. Secondly, when you go and you ask them, what are the 3 or 4 things that worry you most about Google, right? And or the future of Google, of the internet. What you hear, you hear 3 or 4 things, but one always comes out, is antitrust. And the way it's verbalized is, will the FTC, the DOJ, or the European Commission come after Google in the same way the DOJ came after Microsoft? These are obviously somewhat contradictory points of view, because if there is effective competition per fact one, it is probably, possibly unlikely that the second will happen. So, so my answer to your question is, the statements do not sound very helpful to me, because what we miss, or that is what I miss, is a framework that, and a point of view that allows us to understand how this competition of everyone with everyone, to use Kant's words, or as Susan articulates, Apple manufactures devices with iOS software, but encroaches into search with Siri and sells media. Amazon does the same. We don't have the framework to understand that, I think, in the same way that we had a framework to understand competition in the computer industry in the late 90s. We don't. I haven't seen that framework. And second, we don't know the extent to which this competition, or direct or indirect, or co-opetition, if you want to call, is relevant for antitrust, because we haven't seen the framework or enough decision making to see, well, do we care from an antitrust perspective that yes, Apple, certainly for value, will compete with Google, that Amazon will compete with Google. And I think the lack of framework and the lack of a track record of decisions creates uncertainty, and it makes it difficult to make a call. But I don't think the answer is either every sector is dominant, because I think apart from search, I cannot think of any other sector where you have such a dominant player. Certainly not e-commerce, and I don't think that it's clear that competition is widespread and not an issue.
So Hal, is Carlos right about who Google views as its major competitors?
Well, I would say that we view all of the above, a little bit like we heard from Verizon yesterday. I'd like to start out by quoting Keynes. Keynes said, "Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribblers of a few years back." Now, at this meeting, we have a few madmen in authority. We have a great number of academic scribblers. And we might ask, what were they asking a few years back while they were looking at Microsoft? And there were a lot of concepts there, network effects and returns to scale and lock-in and switching costs and so on. And we had an intellectual framework for examining the issues involved in that case. But now, in the situation of platform competition, it's just as we heard, everybody is impinging on everybody else's territory. We have a very, very different competitive dynamic. And to me, this description of a monopoly board just seems totally wrong. For one thing, switching costs are very, very low, and multi-homing is very, very prominent. So if you want to switch from Bing to Google or vice versa, or you want to switch from iPhone to Android, or you want to play Angry Birds on this device or that device, there's really nothing stopping you whatsoever. So how can you have any kind of durable monopoly power when there are many different platforms that interoperate to a greater or lesser degree, and the cost of switching from one platform to another, or indeed multi-homing and using all these platforms at once is very, very low. It's completely common to have a Windows desktop, an Apple laptop, an iPhone, a Google tablet, on and on and on, and they all work together. So this idea that somehow you're locked into a particular platform or particular technology just is not relevant in today's market.
I think we've had more quotes from Keynes at this conference than any previous one.
He's coming back. You know.
I mean, let me just make one comment that, I mean, obviously Netscape was not a major competitor to Microsoft. So I think that, one of the types of frameworks that economists have brought in, and really I found that most of the regulatory folks are very sophisticated on, are the understanding of the sort of vertical nature of some of the antitrust issues. I think the law, has taken longer to really articulate that and catch up, and I see that sort of as a source of tension. But in the end, as an economist, it's fairly easy to understand that Netscape isn't Microsoft's main competitor. They're in some sense a complement in the short run, but they're a nascent competitive threat. And similarly, vertical search sites can be a short-term complement to a search engine, but they're a nascent competitive threat. As people go directly to travel sites and other sites, then eventually you lose your position, and maybe some of the most valuable revenue goes away. So being able to frame the incentives to vertically integrate and to control and pick winners in major lucrative categories, and categories that are most likely to get consumers to go directly to them bypassing the search engine, that's a very easy economic concept, and really the challenge is just how to map it into the law and how to measure the effects and do the counterfactuals in a way that's convincing. So, but I would say that in some sense we don't need a new framework. Everybody I talk to kind of understands the basic economic incentives fairly clearly. So, and I just want to also respond to one of the points, Hal made, and also came up in the big talk this morning about, interoperability and switching costs. And so, on the one hand, we can promote switching costs. On the other hand, one of a key difference in sort of the advertising platforms that fund a lot of these things is the advertiser base. And, Google has 1 million advertisers or so, and the smaller search engines have less, and you can understand it's very easy to measure and observe the incentives to join the platforms, and to see that smaller advertisers are less likely to multi-home and so on, and the costs of monitoring and maintaining campaigns are can be large relative to the benefits you're getting if you're only getting a few clicks a month, but yet a large share of revenue is coming from these small advertisers. And so Google has made it very difficult for people for a ecosystem to evolve that allows people to access search, sort of from a completely transparent perspective. You just have one dashboard, and buying a keyword on Google is the same as buying it on Microsoft, and it's all going through APIs with a beautiful interface provided by a third-party provider. This is something that Google is objected to. So I think that on the one hand, we can all agree that antitrust can really slow down innovation, but at the same time, when you actually have a dominant position, it's very, very tempting to put some friction in the wheels to make sure that competition slows down and that your competitor doesn't monetize as well, which of course makes them a more effective competitor in terms of sharing revenue with the rest of the internet. Remember, the more money Microsoft makes, the more money Google has to share with every other third party that has a Google syndication search. So trying to selectively put friction in the wheels is a very tempting thing, and that's what antitrust can be very effective at. It can say, look, don't do that. We'll have a more competitive market without it. You're great, be great. You shouldn't need to break the law in order to maintain your position.
So we could ask Tom's question: is the consumer-oriented part of the internet, the growth part of the internet, entertainment, Apple, Amazon, products for consumers, Google, is that more like the PC business of the 90s, where you had a dominant firm that could push everybody else around and control the distribution channel? Or is it more like the PC business of the 80s, where the question of which of the many different layers in the stack that dominant firm was going to arise out of was still open? And I'd say, narrowly in that part, it looks to me much more, it has the attributes that Shane Greenstein and I wrote about 15 years ago. There's extensive divided technical leadership. Sure, Google's strong in search, but they can't reach all search customers all the time without dealing with Apple. Sure, Apple wants to lock down the whole vertical stack. They got a strong position in the store on the server side, and they got a terrific position in the devices on the client side, and they just love to lock down the whole stack. But they can't dictate completely the terms of user identity control. For one thing, they've got Google on one flank or Google sponsoring other device makers, and they've also got Facebook. A lot of Facebook users on iPhones and iPads, and that's an alternative definition of the control of user identities. You use your Facebook creds. Now, so I think we're in this space, which is like in the PC business, when anybody could have made it happen. It turned out it was Microsoft that made it happen. They had the enormous asset of Bill Gates. There are a lot of different players that could make it happen in this space. If you ask, what will be the dominant technology for matching buyer and seller in consumer products markets? This is what, I think this is what underlies Carlos' remarks about who are the important competitors for whom. It could be Amazon-like. It could be Google-like. There's a lot of different, that isn't locked down. And there's no better innovation and competition incentives than the race to lock that down. So there might be a dominant firm competition policy problem in the future. I would, but not today. Not today. I just don't see one. I'd let them go. And I'm a pretty prosecutorial guy. Yeah.
Well, why would you think there would be a single winner? You can see that in a situation where there's strong network effects or strong positive feedback. I don't necessarily see that in this platform.
So it might be true that there's not. In which case, it's even better. It's even better. There might be multiple competing technologies out in that year. But suppose, for example, that the Apple guys are right, and that the million, sorry, this is a bigger industry than the one I used to study, the PC industry. The $1 billion question is the quality of the consumer protection promise you can privately offer to consumers. We'll beat up all the app guys. We'll manage all the complementers. Suppose they're right. That would be one scenario in which there might be a problematic position 5 years from now. But that hasn't, we don't know that they're right. There's a real interesting race with a more open competitor, less willing to boss the app developers around. So I would just, the other thing that's in here that's really interesting is that would make me be even more on the current facts as opposed to ideologically cautious about, worried about the monopoly board analogy, is that the existing information and communications technology major players have, at least by now, finally noticed this gigantic explosion of consumer-oriented IT that started first on the server side with Google and Amazon and has exploded on the client side with Apple and Android guys. You know, and so almost all, you know, you heard it yesterday from telecom guys. You know, they think they have to react to the difficult competitive challenges faced by complementors. You know, and when the Microsofts of this world start reacting to the successful consumer devices by bringing in their own, that's a great thing. That's even more potential competition in there. When the oracles of this world try to figure out how to react to the now mostly open source big data stuff, that's terrific too. You know, I mean, so we have that big picture competition, you know, enormous competitive pressure put on traditional ICT by these new innovative initiatives. This would, you know, I wouldn't particularly want to take a real narrow focus on what, you know, on an Amazon or an Apple or a Google and say, oh gee, in a little corner of the forest they're a dangerous monopoly and they're pushing other people around, in an environment where some of their where the traditional ICT guys are looking to counterattack against them. Right? That counterattack ought to be on the merits.
So let me ask. I mean, first of all, let me just would it be correct or incorrect to summarize what you're saying is that this whole sector is becoming more competitive over time?
It's ebbed and flowed. I mean, right now is, you know, where are we standing right now? Right now we're standing at a historical moment where there's been all this innovation in a new area, consumer facing. That creates a moment where there's a lot of stuff up for grabs. There's been other moments like that. There have been times of Microsoft hegemony. There's been times of IBM hegemony.
You know,
it comes and goes.
What makes it very hard for a policymaker to answer your question is that a key change in the Washington representation now is that companies routinely engage in much more frequent visits to the agency to engage in pre-positioning, de-biasing of regulators to describe the industry setting. When the players we've been talking about come in to talk about their own positions, they emphasize the vision of fluidity, dynamism, and massive competition. When they talk about their rivals, it's rigidity, walled gardens, impediments. In effect, what they're telling the policymaker is, with respect to me, just leave me alone. Well, because I face everything. But here are all these other companies that are building the walls and barriers that are going to impede rivalry. And you can imagine them queued up in the waiting room. Next, and in comes another one. And it's the same themes, but just it's another guy that's going to get in the way, but I'm all right.
Well, let me ask a little bit more directly what all you guys seem to be circling around in terms of Microsoft and Google. Obviously, the big case that's kind of looming now is the Google investigation. And some people think that it should become the next Microsoft, and some people are afraid that it will become the next Microsoft. So what are the lessons of the Microsoft case that we should take away when analyzing something like Google?
Let me just say, one response to Tim's comments that in some sense, Microsoft argued it had a lot of competitors and things were coming in on the internet. I think this is just a conjecture. I wasn't working for Microsoft at all during this time. But just looking back at the history, I think in the absence of any antitrust enforcement and any threat of antitrust enforcement, you just take away the whole antitrust framework. Microsoft could have killed Google. They had a lot of access to the consumers. The consumers were coming through Microsoft to access the internet. And if you degraded Google, you changed all the defaults, you didn't let any other browsers play, you did a couple of other things, you could have slowed them down. And there's a lot of scale economies in this industry. And so, they had a technical advantage. Of course, they also bought a lot of things and did some integration at the time that helped them get started. So there was a bunch of things Google did. But in some sense, there was a time when that could have been tilted another way. Now, would that have been good or bad? Would we have been better off if Microsoft, had 95% market share of search in Europe rather than Google? I'm not taking a position on that. But and maybe slightly less aggressive antitrust enforcement could have led to a more balanced search market today. But so there are many people in this room have dissected this case to death. So I don't want to say repeat all of the pros and cons and the goods and bads. But I will say that just in this particular arena, the antitrust enforcement I think did make a difference, and it for good or for bad allowed a nation. It turned out it wasn't exactly what people envisioned in '97 or '98 what it was going to be. But in the end, Google was that threat that they had envisioned in some sense, something that's coming in, another way of accessing information that wasn't them, that gained a lot of power. So just saying okay, like competition is going to work all of this out. Well, the antitrust framework did facilitate competition, maybe too much, maybe too little. And similarly today, if you've got a bottleneck at one place that's very key in the innovation pipeline, it doesn't, just because generally Google thinks that they're competing with Facebook, doesn't mean that their behavior in the place where they've got market power is irrelevant.
Well, actually, I think you're right about that statement, that counterfactual history. But the one qualification you want to add is, if Microsoft had noticed Google, because Microsoft didn't really notice Google until 2004, and if Sony had noticed Apple, then we would have had a different history. A lot of times these threats that come in are coming from a place that you never really thought of them originating. And I think that's going to be true going into the future as well.
Let me go back to something that Bill raised and then give the audience a chance, which is the other jurisdictions. So I got a call from a reporter, I don't know, a month ago, talking about Google and the EU, and basically the thrust of the question was, if Google and EU come to some sort of an agreement, does that mean really that U.S. authorities in practice can do nothing less? And I said it was a hypothetical. I said I didn't know, but let me ask you the question. Bill. Yeah.
As a practical matter, I think it would take enormous institutional fortitude for the FTC to simply stand down if the EU goes first. Because the way in the modern world that you establish the significance of your institution, the way that, again, given the report card that the world uses, journalists foremost among them, to evaluate agencies is who's doing the most stuff. The question isn't posed who's doing the most useful stuff in terms of improving economic performance, but the most heavily weighted variable in that assessment is activity. If you have, for an agency, if you have spent a huge amount of resources, if you fought aggressively to get the file in the first instance from that other agency, which you did, and you've continued to hold out a matter in some sense as being the measure of who you are, that defines your presence, it becomes extremely difficult as that train picks up speed to ultimately decide we're going to stop. And it means that, and of course the FTC inquiry is dissimilar from the EU inquiry. They're not absolutely congruent, so there would be aside from the process of staking a claim and showing your presence, there would be a basis for a different result, but it becomes generally very difficult for an institution, especially a US institution, to simply stand down and say, that covered it, and then to go away. Your legislature would scream at you for not using your authority. Why rely on them? But second, as a part of institutional imperatives, the question will be raised, what on earth were you doing there anyway? Why weren't you first? Why didn't you get to the finish line first? It's extremely difficult to imagine that if they go first, the US will not do something different, and that South Korea will not do something different and distinctive, and that Japan will not do something distinctive and different. And as you go through the world of enforcers, you might accumulate 5, 6, 7, 8 different orders.
Anybody else want to?
Well, that's addressing the kind of political realities as you see them, but wouldn't you think it would be a better world if you had a uniform environment in which you could operate?
Uniformity on the right standards would be great. Uniformity on bad standards would not. And the real challenge internationally is to get the right standards. But what we have now, the dynamic that takes place now, is that the most intervention-minded jurisdiction sets the standard. And that's what companies have to work to.
But that's the EU from what you said earlier.
Correct, yes.
I had the great good fortune to work for Intel on the Intel McAfee merger, purely vertical merger, extremely pro-competitive, where both the FTC and the EU reviewed it. And the FTC was, the counterpoint to what Bill just said is that the FTC, looking at itself in contrast to the EU, feels not only the competitive race to take the scalp, but also feels the intellectual competitive race to be tough-minded and only to, even if after there's been an investigation, to file a complaint only if there's something there that they are convinced harms the American consumer. So that you can get very substantial divergence, particularly, on things, and I bring that up because it's apropos. That's a vertical merger. Vertical mergers have, in terms of the mechanisms by which consumers might be harmed, are very similar to monopolization cases. The biggest difference across the Atlantic is, I'm not a process guy, but the biggest difference across the Atlantic is process. At the EU, you have to convince, if you're the complaining attorney, you have to convince your boss. In the US, you have to walk out into federal court. Those are really different. And at the EU, if you've opened an investigation, you have to explain why you didn't listen to all the whiny competitors who thought they were harmed. Whereas in the US, if you open an investigation, you can shut it down. So there's just these procedural differences which make enormous, create an enormous amount of transatlantic variety. And the one, I don't think we're going to see a lot of Me Too. We wouldn't have seen a lot of Me Too cases out of FTC when Bill was there, and we're not going to see them now.
Let me chime in on this subject, and obviously I can't comment.
I was trying to avoid.
Well, I can't comment on Google or any particular case, but I will say that obviously we're keeping a close eye on what's happening around the world, and we have to. Recently, there was a merger investigation involving hard-disk drive merger, and that there were 11 other jurisdictions looking at this transaction. So we're collaborating at an international level. I mean, Bill was the leader at the FTC when he was there, and there's a lot of activity on the international front. We are cooperating closely with the EC, and in my view, again, we're going to do what we think is right, and the U.S. remains relevant, and frankly, in most of the cases, there will be particular facts that are jurisdiction-driven. So while we will increasingly see more investigations that are multilateral in scope, for the most part, I would say that the highest number remains ones that are U.S.-focused.
Well, let me give the audience a chance and see if there are questions from the audience. Ed?
Yes, just a couple quick points. First, before we get to antitrust, what Bill said about patents and the FTC role and DOJ was tremendous. That was a blueprint for the future. We need to go back and do that kind of work again. On antitrust issues, again, I think the FTC on the Intel case did a great job, but you did have a really solid market definition. You knew what the player was. You had a great amount of evidence of willful wrongdoing. It was a valid action, and I think it enhanced the credibility of the FTC for taking that strong action. I had a little involvement in the Microsoft case, and I would say it was pretty clear there, too, that you had some solid market definitions. You had clear evidence of not just barriers to entry that came into play, but barriers that were actually erected consciously in terms of interoperability problems, et cetera. So, again, I think there was a strong grounds for going forward. In the increasingly dynamic, innovative space where we have disruptive technologies and new companies, the Pinterests, and people starting up and becoming substantial companies fairly quickly. I think it's more important to recognize that market boundaries are much more fluid. The lack of barriers to entry, I mean, just look at the number of companies getting into all kinds of business are really slim. And I guess I have yet to see, I've seen allegations of wrongful conduct. I've not seen the kind of massive evidence that we saw in Intel and other cases. And the final thing that you really want to take action is proof of real competitive harm or consumer harm. And I guess I haven't heard a lot of discussion about the allegations of misbehavior and how they play out according to those criteria.
Did you want to, you didn't want to make that a question?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm saying, is there
I can take it as a question.
Question in there or something.
I will turn the question.
All right,
I'd like
Susan
the
will
person who's
understand.
going to
I think I hear a
Susan
question.
understands the question that is there.
Well, I think one issue that you raised that we had talked about discussing on this panel is the economic frameworks that we're using. So I think I found the broader community that's been discussing antitrust issues in this sector have been fairly sophisticated about the qualitative economics. But one of the things that's tricky, okay, you have multi-sided markets. Generally, the economic regulators get that, which is great because it's actually kind of a sophisticated concept where you're doing something on one side of the market to gain an advantage on another side of the market. Particularly, if one side of the market is free, and you think of your consumers are the web consumers, and they might not even really understand what has happened to them, good or bad. They see that they are finding a certain set of websites. They don't realize that other websites weren't invented or were never surfaced for them because they were competitors of the search engine. So the consumers, unlike a price increase, don't really understand exactly how they've been harmed. And the counterfactuals are difficult because they're about, a lot of this is about the invention of companies, that you have to go talk to the VCs and realize that, if you go talk to a VC and you're in a certain kind of business, one of the first questions is, okay, what's the probability you're going to get squashed by Google? Just like, by the way, way back in the Microsoft case, people were talking about all the firms that were worried about getting, bundled with Microsoft and, losing their investment. But I will say that, the more sophisticated analysts of this case, again, understand the qualitative parts, but it doesn't mean it doesn't create challenges because we all understand how to do the counterfactuals of a price increase, but it's more difficult to do the counterfactuals of a higher quality product that's given away for free. Now in the search business, there's the advertiser side of the market and their customers too, and so they can advocate for themselves about how they're harmed. But and the publishers out there as well are another constituent that is providing in-consumer benefit, and they benefit from search competition because they get more funding in order to provide an incentive to create their product. But I would say that broadly, the fact that you're dealing with products that are often free more and more does create not insurmountable challenges, but challenges for our overall evaluation of all of this. We're not just going out and saying, okay, if Coke and Pepsi merge, they're going to raise their price by 25%, and we can all agree that, a higher price for the same product is worse than a lower price. It's more challenging when it's the quality of a product, it's the innovation, and so on. But of course, much more important, really, 5 cents on a can of Coke, versus the invention of new products and services. Is probably the new product and services, some great new travel service or whatever that's going to help everybody find better airfares and so on. That's probably more important.
I think, Ed, you remember in Microsoft, the Department of Justice, when asked, have consumers suffered yet, said not yet. It was the likelihood of harm that provided the basis for the finding of liability at the district court and the Court of Appeals. And the hard question is, what kind of evidence do you have to marshal, as Susan was just suggesting, that gives you confidence to assume that if unimpeded, you will see the complement not turning into the substitute. You will see the reduction in innovation. So that even in Microsoft, the department said, adverse effects to this point, not yet, but it's what's going to go bad in the future. And that's the tough thing, I think, for the enforcement agencies, providing the confident basis for making that kind of judgment.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I will take issue with one thing you said, Susan, and that is this issue of the search engine precluding competition or degradation of quality. When you do a search for price comparison or airfare to Denver, any of these things, you're getting a page of search results. And it may well be that the guy in position 14 says, gee, I really should be in position 1 or position 2. But what that means is the guys in position 2 through 13 should all be shifted down 1. So it's not as if there's a blank page when you search for these providers of similar services. You're getting a list of providers, and that list of providers is organized, I think in the case of both Bing and Google, organized to the best of ability of those search engines to find what the relevant services are. So you're not reducing choice in any way by this activity.
So, I mean, there are the boxes that promote your own services that get a lot of clicks and take clicks away from the rest of the page. I would say, you know, in the American Airlines Sabre case, you know, I think we all understood, and that actually gets back to this question of free goods and price goods. I think it was very clear to people why it was bad for Sabre to put American connecting flights on the first page and nonstop flights of competitors on the second page. People understood that you were controlling the screen. This was a very search-like example that if you put stuff on the first screen, it was going to get more purchases than stuff on the second screen. So if you put connecting flights on the first screen, then, you know, you could charge a higher price for them than if you were trying to actually compete head-to-head in a fair way with a superior product. Now, American could have said, well, you know what, actually consumer welfare is really better because we think our American products are a lot better. We built this reservation system after all, so we should be able to put our connecting flights, and we think that the consumer will be happier taking a connecting flight than a nonstop flight on our lovely American plane, and in fact, if the prices are high, that's great. But you know, that's not super compelling. I think it's so obviously wrong, partly because of you're influencing the price competition. But it's really, there's nothing really different about this analogy except that the services that you're ranking are sort of in quality competition rather than price competition.
Yeah, but is there any argument anywhere, any study that's ever been done that the search results that are higher up on Google involve connecting flights or some obvious degradation of quality? Not at all.
They have Google Finance above Yahoo Finance.
Google, well, what happens is if you search for
and it's still the most popular.
If you search for Google, you're going to get a stock price first, just as you do on Bing, by the way, and where Microsoft Finance is the first result there. In both cases, the search engines are trying to provide the best quality results for the user. They're not trying to pick favorites among these other choices. They're trying to say, what does the user want? They want to know that ticker price. They want to be able to plot the movement of that stock. So that's the goal. The goal is to get the user to where they want most quickly and conveniently.
If that box was populated with Yahoo results, the user might be even happier.
They might be even happier if the Yahoo box was populated with Bing. But you know, this is a situation where everybody's trying to provide a good service for the user.
Shane.
So I have a question about competition policy for the merger guidelines. Some time ago, the merger guidelines were appended with a large section of writing about what to do in high-tech industries. And for those of us who know those sections, it was primarily oriented towards the pharmaceutical industry. At the time, Rich Gilbert had a lot to do with writing that section. And the question I have for you is, are we at a moment where the merger guidelines would benefit from a section devoted to platform competition for the same purposes as the pharma section was? Remove some of the ad hoc discussion that arises every time a new case comes up, promote transparency for attorneys who may or may not be bringing cases and want to anticipate what reaction they're going to get from the agency, and so forth. That's the question.
I think that Carl and Joe, in taking the first pass at drafting them, thought they were creating a framework that was adaptable enough to incorporate these kinds of concerns. And I think there was a general desire to focus more on a broader framework of universal application rather than have idiosyncratic sector-by-sector treatments. I think also that another aim in designing the document or expectation was that there would be perhaps a more frequent process of elaboration and adjustment over time. That is, this fundamental product had been on the shelf since 1992. With a single minor upgrade in '97, that was a long time ago. So I think an implication of this is that you've got to come back to this more frequently. Another open question, though, is that if you ask, because many of these issues involve vertical issues, vertical questions. When was the last time that the government of the United States in any form touched the question of vertical merger guidelines? That would be 1984. That's just a small time ago in the area in which we're talking about. I think I can understand completely why you would take horizontal mergers first, but who's got the best product out there in the competition policy store of guidelines today? It's the European Union. Their vertical merger guidelines really took the state of the art forward by asking fundamental questions about ability, incentives, history with respect to foreclosure stories. It's really a nice piece of work, and I guess if I were thinking about the sorts of things that the U.S. policymakers should do, because so many of these questions are a combination of horizontal and vertical stories, foreclosure stories, when are we going to see the 1984 product taken out? I don't think you'd go and buy a software product that had an 84 label on it. I think the U.S. community ought to have something better. And that would be an important next frontier. But on the others, I would expect a more frequent process of simply put upgrades and waiting 20 years to upgrade that document. Although there were interim measures that you allude to, Shane, I think this is an area where the rate of speed, the rate of change means this is something you have to come back to every 5 years, not every 20.
Let me ask a question on a slightly different subject, which we haven't gotten to yet, but the whole issue of remedies, which obviously was a huge issue in a problem in the Microsoft case and is a huge problem in any of these issues. Now the FTC, this was mentioned yesterday, and the FTC just changed or rescinded its policy statement on disgorgement, or basically on fines. So I guess the question is a greater use of having the freedom to use fines of various sorts more prominently in the arsenal. Is that a good thing or not a good thing? Anybody want to take that?
Fines are broadly irrelevant to the biggest cases because there's so much money on the table. The structural remedies versus complex interoperability rules, I think which we've seen in some recent vertical mergers. That's a more interesting open policy area. I mean, for smaller cases, but smaller cases don't create a lot of billions of dollars of good or harm.
Just to build on that as a guess, I think if the remedy of the FTC investigation was X $1 billion fine on Google, the stock would go up.
Easy.
Okay.
Easy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
X being any number?
No, 3, 4, $5 billion. I mean, pick a number, right? But the stock will go up.
Tom, the conception of the FTC and this elastic unfair methods of competition provision, the administrative adjudication process, the whole purpose of the agency was to engage in norms creation, that is to adjust boundaries, and have the specialized tribunal that would, compared to the typical generalist federal judge, would be able to deal with these kinds of issues. The big trade-off Congress put in place was you have the ability to reset standards, but you're going to do it with comparatively light-handed remedies. The ability to use that flexibility depends a lot on not scaring judges about coming right behind it, and it would be in a federal court case. By the way, we want a lot of money back. The more open-ended you suggest that power is, the more cramped the application of this norms adjustment function would be. And I saw nothing in the Commission's statement that even recognized the trade-off that went back to the roots. If you'd had a public comment period, that might have been surfaced as a consideration, but that didn't happen.
The tort parasites are also about to come out of the woodwork. When, you know, anything that the federal agencies cannot control the amount of deterrence that flows through fines. That's controlled by the ground rules of the class action plaintiffs bar, whom I just dissed. If any of you were here, my apologies.
Let me comment on this issue about the recent withdrawal of the disgorgement statement. And I'm speaking just personally here. I don't foresee that signaling any dramatic shift in the way the FTC has been handling it. We did believe that that current law provides adequate guidance. I don't think that public comment would have shed any particular light on this debate. And I think that all we wanted to do was to make sure that there wouldn't be an impediment to us in the litigation context. That was certainly one consideration of that being waived at us. If we felt that in an appropriate case, it would be appropriate to seek a monetary remedy.
Harold.
So I had a question for anybody on the panel with regard to the appropriate role of behavioral economics in the analysis. In communications law, we've kind of gone through cycles on this. A lot of what Congress didn't say, the 1992 Act and some of what was done in the 1996 Act was designed to address behavioral issues that are hard to quantify using traditional tools, but which can have significant impact on consumer behavior. The sort of classic example being, it turned out if you as a consumer had to get up and flip your switch on your cable box from A to B, that had huge impact on what television shows you were watching. In terms of the role in antitrust policy, one of the criticisms has been that antitrust tends to be kind of blind to harder to quantify through traditional economic tools, small things that can have huge impact on consumer behavior. I think perhaps the archetypal example that Susan alluded to earlier was, when Google puts Google Map next to, immediately next to the locations, the use of MapQuest drops by some outrageous amount. And I guess the question we have is, should we care? Should there be a role for behavioral economics in antitrust analysis, or do you think there is one right now, and that those people who've criticized antitrust for not taking into account these sorts of issues are wrong?
Yeah.
So I have a couple responses to that. The first is that, in some sense, like historically, like over a 30-year period, in economics, the idea of behavioral economics was often sort of a synonym for hand waving, or saying that laws of competition didn't work, or other things. And one of the things that's really nice about the kind of online services space is that a lot of the things are measurable. So you can measure the effect, and Google runs experiments and Microsoft runs experiments, and if you re-rank results, you know exactly what's going to happen. And so in some sense, the answers to the short term, of course, the long term is often what's important and harder to measure, but the short term consequences of things like page layout and stuff are actually quite easy to measure fairly definitively, the short term consequences. So, and then we see, in fact, that ranking matters a lot, and the color of the box and the background and the font, and it can, if you put up some great content on the top of the page, suddenly your ad clicks go down, and all of this is measurable, so that it's not just sort of real, but it's almost, you don't even put the label of behavioral economics on it, because it's just empirical economics. It's just that, okay, if I make my algorithmic results X times better, it costs me Y billion dollars of revenue. Boom. And you don't even have to give it a label, it's just a fact. So in that sense, it's incorporated, and it's so much that it's sort of lost its label. On the sort of bigger picture stuff, I have a few comments as well. The switching cost is such an interesting one, because it seems like in this space, like the switching costs are small until they're not. You know, so we used to be fine, like, oh, I'd switch from one platform to another with my mobile phone with each generation, you know, and with, you know, with gaming, people would switch platforms from generation to generation. But then suddenly people have, you know, 75 iPhone apps, and they don't want to switch. You know, so the nature of the switching cost and the relevance to consumers can really change. Or, you know, first, you know, I'm really attached to my iTunes because I remember buying all these CDs and uploading them. And then suddenly, you know, I get onto some subscription service and I've forgotten about my CDs. So the switching costs, and I think that is sort of behavioral economics, not the fact that qualitatively it makes economic sense, but like the sort of these changes seem almost discontinuous sometimes and hard to predict about when the consumer, you know, feels locked in and then they don't. You know, they may be doing Google every day and there's nothing you can do, and even if your search engine is better, they're just in the habit of Google, and Google's a verb and you just use it, and then maybe one day, you know, Google screws up and people actually, it's something, and they have some privacy thing or something else, and people, a whole bunch of people actually compare, and then suddenly they pay attention to your quality and they switch. So it can be a little bit hard to predict, and I think that does fall into behavioral economics. And I think the area of privacy is similar to that in some sense people go along and they don't care and they don't care and they don't care, and then something brings it into their consciousness and suddenly it becomes an important issue. So it becomes hard for the firms to predict, as well as hard for the regulators to predict what do these consumers want, because if you measure today, they're not really responding to it, but then, you know, actually they might at some higher level care.
We are actually out of time. I want to thank the panel for a great discussion. If everybody, we have a short break scheduled, so if everybody could be back here by 11, that would be great.